All right, everybody, gather around and I'll tell you a story about Bob and his journey to cure starvation mode. Bob was a little heavy and had tried everything over the years, pills, cleanses, fasts, and nothing seemed to help. Then one day, he started a diet, ate less, and gained weight. So frustrated, he went to the diet wizard at the top of the mountain. The wizard told Bob that because of his years of dieting and the influence of dark forces, the fire inside him was out. He was under the curse of starvation mode. To cure him of the curse, the diet wizard gave Bob a list of exactly the kinds of things he could eat and told him to eat more. Now, Bob had never heard advice like that. So maybe that's why it would work this time. Hopeful and out of options, Bob followed the wizard's instructions to the letter, filling his belly and losing weight. And heartened by his new success, Bob returned to the villagers to tell them about the wonders of the wizard's advice and to warn them of the dangers of starvation mode. Now, wasn't that a good story? And to be clear, it is just a story. Specifically, a myth. Starvation mode isn't real, but if you search for the term, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of coaches and dieters who are absolutely convinced that their metabolism is broken, that they're eating Oliver Twist level calories and the only way they can lose weight is to eat more. The mechanics don't line up, but something is happening. And if we knew what that something was, it might help us get a better understanding of food, diet, and how diet culture gets us stuck in cycles of failure that leave us worse off than when we started. To get at that, we have to dial in on metabolism. What is it, and how does it work? First off, all activity takes energy. We typically think of the term energy loosely, but in mechanical terms, it is very real, precise, and applies the same way whether you're talking about moving your body or your car. To move your car, you start with stored energy, something that is loaded with molecules made of hydrogen and carbon, because when those molecules are mixed with oxygen and break apart, they release a lot of energy. In other words, hydrocarbons are flammable. This storage form isn't immediately useful, so your car has to shrink it down to particles small enough to burn effectively. This newly atomized fuel is brought to the combustion chamber where the spark plug ignites it. This explosion creates heat, light, and force. Carefully controlled and directed, it moves a piston which is connected through a series of mechanical steps to a wheel. So matter, gasoline, is burned, which releases energy, which does work. Now, I made a mistake, and I hope you caught it, when I said that an explosion creates heat, light, and force. Not really. A chemical reaction broke the molecules that make up the gasoline into simpler forms, which releases the heat and light we call an explosion, along with the pressure that moves the piston and new, simpler molecules. So burning fuel doesn't just make atoms poof. With the reaction complete, the fuel you burned is still there. It's just carbon dioxide and water in the form of steam, along with thousands of other trace compounds that get caught up in the process. And we now call this exhaust and have to get it out of the chamber so the process can start over. So if we take a car with an empty 20-gallon tank and fill it with gasoline, we've now added approximately 120 pounds to the weight of the car. That extra mass doesn't just vanish like magic. Every second your car is burning gasoline, it is losing weight through exhaust. The same thing is happening to you. You start with stored fuel, food, which is loaded with flammable hydrocarbons. Food as a storage form isn't immediately useful, so your body has to shrink it down through digestion to particles small enough to burn effectively. Individual molecules of fat and sugar. The digested fuel is brought into the cell, and this is where the body is a little different than a car. Instead of igniting the fuel in explosions, the body burns it slowly over multiple steps. It's still combustion. It's still oxygen mixing with fuel to create a chemical reaction that releases heat, light, and force. Just slower. Carefully controlled and directed, the energy released in these reactions is used to do one very specific job. It reloads this mobile cellular energy packet called ATP that mechanically connects at different places in the body to create movement. And the fuel you burned is still there. Now it's just carbon dioxide and water, which we now have to exhaust and get out of the cell so the process can start over. So if I fed you 4 bananas, then the moment you took your last bite, you would weigh about 1 pound heavier than when you started. And the sugars in these bananas would either be burned or stored, and every moment that you're alive, you are losing little bits of that stored mass with every breath you take. Now, we tend to measure this energy in capital C calories or kilocalories, which according to the dictionary is the amount of heat necessary to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius at 1 atmosphere of pressure. What does the temperature of water have to do with my diet? When scientists were first trying to figure out how much energy is in the food that we eat, they realized that combustion, whether it's in your body or in a fire, is a pretty similar process. They both release exhaust, they both release heat, light, energy. So if you burn food in a special device that measures very precisely how much energy is released by that food as it burns, by how much it changes the temperature of water, you know pretty close to how much energy was in that food. That device is called a bomb calorimeter, and scientists in the 19th and 20th centuries figured out how much energy is in 1 gram of different types of food. So when you burn calories, you could theoretically be losing very different amounts of mass. To burn 1 pound of body mass entirely as fat, you need to expend about 4,100 calories of energy. To burn 1 pound of sugar in your body, you need to expend about 1,800 calories. But in reality, the mix of sugar and fat we burn over a day is very similar, and it's mostly fat, which is why we get to the rule of thumb that burning 3,500 calories leads to the loss of 1 pound. When you combine all of the actions that you need to live, whether it's at the cellular level or you moving around, you end up with total daily energy expenditure, or TDEE. The whole TDEE is made up of different components. You have basal metabolic rate, which is the sum of unconscious automatic actions your body uses just to keep you alive. Then there's directed activity, whether that's exercise activity or non-exercise activity. Then you have the thermic effect of food, which is the calories you need to burn just to break down, digest, absorb, and store the food that you eat. Eat below your TDEE, and you'll lose mass as you breathe and not enough food comes in to replace that mass. Eat above your TDEE, and whatever excess calories you take in are stored a little bit as sugar and glycogen, but most of it is fat. This amount is approximately predictable. If you take in 1,000 calories per day above your TDEE, you'll gain about 2 pounds in a week. Ish. Now, it won't look like that on the scale. First, because how much you weigh at any given moment depends on when you last ate, when you last used the restroom, how hydrated you are. And some of this mass that you're losing comes attached to water. So at the beginning of a diet, you'll lose some weight for free. This whole process of energy burn and eating more or less than you need is what people mean when they say calories in versus calories out. We got the primer out of the way. It's all mathematical and simple. Calories in, calories out, no problem. Except for one little thing. TDEE changes. As you diet, your daily energy burn goes down over time for a few big reasons. The first is that the mass you're losing has a direct effect on every element of that TDEE stack. There's your basal metabolic rate. Every tissue in your body needs some energy, including fat. So as you lose fat in other tissues, you don't need as much of that to stay alive. Then there's thermic effect of food. You're eating less food, so you need less energy to digest and absorb that food. And then you weigh less, so you're burning fewer calories, exerting work against gravity. The second reason is compensation. These are the ways that your body, without your awareness, changes that energy balance equation both through internal processes and by influencing your behaviors. On the calories in side, your body releases more hormones that stimulate hunger. It also mechanically tries to extract more calories out of the food you eat, but it doesn't get much from this because it's already pretty efficient at it. On the calories outside, hormones and neurotransmitters shift to decrease your urge to move, whether that's through exercise or even things that you're not aware of, like wanting to take more naps or fidgeting less. And at the cellular level, your body will start to prioritize certain systems. The way that if you were running low on propane, you might turn down or turn off some burners on a stove to make sure that you could keep burning for longer. So for you nerds who, when I said starvation mode isn't real, were like, but what about metabolic adaptation? Yeah, that's this. It's real. It affects people differently in different ways, and the best study that I know to show this is Reinhardt et al. 2015.
They took 12 obese volunteers and thoroughly measured both their intake and their expenditure through the whole experiment with incredibly sophisticated tools. They then put the subjects through a fast day and an overfeeding day and measured how strongly their bodies compensated for the change in calories. Then they put those same 12 subjects on a diet of 50% of their caloric needs, so they were eating an average of about 1,160 calories for 6 weeks.
There were a lot of really neat findings in this study. We're not going to be able to go over all of them, but the biggest takeaways for our purposes first is that the subjects whose bodies compensated the most during the underfeeding phase and the overfeeding phase, those one-day tests, lost the least weight over the 6-week diet, even though they were restricted the same amount. The second thing, though, is that everyone lost weight. The starvation mode myth requires that your metabolism could slow down to the point where 1,500 calories, 1,200 calories, 1,000 calories, you could still not lose weight. But anytime it's accurately measured in a lab under controlled conditions, it doesn't pan out. You might argue, it's just 12 subjects. With billions of people, surely there are outliers, super thrifters, who could go down to 1,200 calories and not lose weight. But there's a whole body of research on VLCDs, very low calorie diets, and it's not looking good for starvation mode. One classic on this front was a Swiss study that followed thousands of women for a 6 to 10 week diet with a 1-year follow-up. 2 of the groups were put on a shake-only diet. They were told to only drink these particular shakes, which were set at either very low calorie or low calorie. And then a third group that was prescribed a high protein, whole food diet aiming for 1,500 to 1,800 calories. The researchers didn't have control over these women. They could have cheated when they went home and eaten snacks or something, but despite that, every woman who completed the study in the very low calorie and low calorie shake group lost weight. The last argument that diet wizards make is that starvation mode and being able to go to 1,200, even 1,000 calories and not lose weight is the result of metabolic damage caused by extended dieting for years or diets that are too extreme. The idea is that this damage could persist for a long time after conditions return to normal, but you're not going to see that in a 6-week or even a 1-year trial. This idea of a metabolic PTSD was inspired by research going back to the 1950s. But as Anastasia Zinchenko and Menno Henselman showed in their 2016 paper, those papers had some critical flaws, and under reanalysis, it doesn't appear to have shown that effect. Now, the idea got a reboot in 2016 when a group of researchers looked at the Biggest Loser participants and evaluated them years after the show was over. If you don't remember the show, contestants with a lot of weight to lose were put through a diet and exercise program that, let's charitably call it unsustainable.
Go! You have the ability to shut up and focus and do the work, but you don't.
And the ones who lost the least weight after each week in the program were progressively sent home survivor style. The researchers found that although they had all partially regained some of the weight that they had lost, their resting metabolic rate, the amount of calories they burned when they were at rest, didn't match what it should have been given the regain. So, metabolic damage? But even this extreme program, which you'd think would be guaranteed to cause metabolic damage if anything could, probably didn't. So, a few researchers found shortly after in a reanalysis that they made some errors and it probably didn't show the effect. But the nail in the coffin came from one of the researchers on the original study who came to wonder if resting metabolic rate was really the right measure. Those with higher activity levels tend to have lower resting metabolic rates. That's one of the ways that the body seems to compensate for activity to keep energy burn as constant as it can. When Kevin Hall reevaluated the data, he found that the contestants who exercised the most after the show was done not only regained the least weight, but showed the greatest difference between their predicted resting heart rate and their actual resting heart rate. Their metabolism wasn't damaged, it was responding to the fact that they had kept exercising. There's one last piece to the puzzle, and to click it in place, I have to admit I've been oversimplifying things. But rather than just explain how, I'll show you with the most vivid study ever done on this topic, the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. The study itself was published in 1950, where 34 volunteers were assessed for their daily calorie needs and assigned a baseline work and normal activity, and then were put on a diet of about 1,600 calories for 6 months. Their bodies continued to fuel basic functions from stores of fat, but it didn't take very long before their brains started to recognize there's not enough food coming in and start to cut things back. Some of these cutbacks were physical, and so they were easily observed. Their resting heart rate dropped, their nails stopped growing, hair started falling out, they lost 2.5 pounds of weight per week. Other symptoms were sensory and more behavioral, harder to pin down. They felt sore more easily, started to hurt sitting down, they felt colder more often, more irritable, lost libido, felt compelled to over-smoke and over-drink caffeine, their sleep was disturbed, and they were having dreams about cannibalism. And remember, all of this happened at an intake of 1,600 calories a day. Metabolism isn't just a stat on a character sheet or a difficulty mode setting on a diet. It's a sequence of priorities that your body makes to keep you alive. There's no such thing as starvation mode. There's just starvation. So as I've probably broken down in too much detail, metabolic adaptation is real. Starvation mode, not so much. And the difference between the two comes in a few key details. The first is that metabolism will never adapt beyond the deficit. So if I start taking in 1,000 less calories than I normally eat, my metabolism is not going to drop by 1,001 calories. And the practical distinction is this: all else being equal, you're not going to gain weight from eating less. And you're never going to lose weight by eating more. Also, metabolic adaptation has a floor. Otherwise, no one would ever die of hunger. We'll go over that floor and what we think that is in a second. But for now, let's get back to Bob. Because Bob and thousands and tens of thousands like him have had an experience where they feel like they're eating more and losing weight. So, what's happening? We'll start by asking, who is Bob? More often than not, Bob has a tough relationship with food. He may have a lot of comfort food. He may stress eat a lot. He often has a lifetime of eating habits where treat foods like Sodas and dessert pastries and ultra-processed pizzas are everyday foods or sometimes even every meal foods. Bob is also often a wave dieter, fading in and out between more intentional diets and not, but always somewhere keeping in the back of his mind his weight. So he often makes small sacrifices like getting the diet soda instead of the regular soda, getting the organic instead of the non-organic, or the baked chips instead of the regular potato chips. But although these feel like sacrifices, they're really not going to move the needle, and he often compensates for them in ways that he doesn't notice. Bob may also be a hard loser, one of those subjects with a thrifty metabolism from that study earlier. So when people around him diet, they see results that he doesn't see, and he needs to go to greater deficits to see the same success. Because of all this, Bob is often very engaged about food. He reads about it, thinks about it, talks about it a lot more than the people giving him unsolicited advice on the internet. Unfortunately though, most of the advice available is bad. So Bob may be very informed and very misinformed. And Bob may struggle with shame, either internalized shame or the stress and stigma that comes with being overweight or obese. And that shame, that stress, that stigma can make it harder to lose weight. And we're gonna add one last piece to the puzzle that explains why the Bobs of the world think starvation mode is real. That's that Bob isn't eating the 1,200 calories he thinks he is. So 1,200 is one of those numbers that gets tossed around a lot. So let's see what 1,200 calories actually looks like in a day. So you can start off your breakfast, not bad. A bagel with a little bit of butter on it and a cup of cereal with half a cup of 2% milk. For lunch, you get a tortilla with avocado and 2 eggs. All right, and that leaves us at 1,000 calories. So for dinner, I guess we're eating Costco canned chicken breast. I guarantee you, Bob is eating more than that on average, and he doesn't realize it because as a general rule, the Bobs of the world don't systematically weigh, measure, and record what they eat. And that's not a bad thing. It's weird to scan every barcode, weigh every cashew, measure every tablespoon of olive oil, and put it into an app. It's not wrong. It can be appropriate at times, but it is weird. And until Bob diligently goes through that process, he doesn't actually know how much he eats. And rigorous accuracy here is hard. Bob would have to eat out less, since restaurant foods, especially sides, can be seriously over or under the listed calories. And that's when calories are even listed. And he'd have to reduce his use of packaged foods, since they lean towards having about 5% more calories than are listed on the label. He'd have to be on it every day, because if he gives into weekend syndrome, where he's dialed in during the week but leaves out tracking over the weekend, he may not realize just how quickly his average intake rises. And maybe he is always trying, always on. But if he's estimating his food instead of weighing and measuring it, he can come close, but there's error there. And the human habit of eating at the edge of our estimations as our diets cut deeper will affect that accuracy. On top of that, Bob has your usual quirks around food. He occasionally grabs a snack that's too small or too quick to really be worth recording, he thinks. Or, this is something that I learned through my tracking, he might just grab an uneaten bite off of his kid's lunch tray, and it doesn't even register as food. It's just cleaning up. A recent example that made this abundantly clear was when a 63-year-old, 245-pound powerlifter claimed to be thriving on 75 grams of protein and no more than 1,500 calories a day. Remember, 1,500 calories for 6 months turned the Minnesota Volunteers into this. When I pointed that out, he graciously replied with what he ate in an average day. So curious, I put that into a tracking app. Just based on his own account, he was taking in at least 1,800 calories a day and 130 grams of protein. I don't think he's dumb or a grifter or lying. It's just really hard to know mechanically what we eat. And we have the research to show it. Across the board, people tend to underestimate what they ate when they try to report their intake. And the less subjects think they're eating, the more they tend to underestimate. That powerlifter, he wasn't eating 1,500 calories. And I know with confidence that he wasn't eating 1,800 calories either. How could I be so sure? Well, this is where we get to the calorie floor. In 2012, Pontzer et al. Did a study of a hunter-gatherer Hadza population, an agricultural population, and a Western population, and found that when weight was equated, there wasn't a difference in their daily energy expenditure. So mark that. They had wildly different lifestyles, but the same daily calorie burn. In 2021, Dr. Pontzer and a team of researchers analyzed a lot of different studies measuring people's daily energy expenditure, and they assessed it for weight and age and physical activity level and all these other factors to see what affects metabolism over the lifespan. And interestingly enough, the biggest factor was mass. There was certainly variation between individuals, about 25%, but we had even more evidence now that size is the driving factor behind metabolism. But the real hit came in 2022 when Dr. Pontzer released his book Burn and made it very relevant to the Bobs of the world by measuring and comparing all this data by absolute calories. With over 10,000 subjects, Dr. Pontzer took their average daily calorie intake, mapped it along with their weight, and provided the mean and variation. And this brought a lot into focus. There is a broad range. 80% of women weighing 160 pounds could expect to have a daily calorie need between 1,800 calories and 2,900 calories. That's an 1,100 calorie difference. But it also showed that there are no grown adults eating 1,200 calories in a day, even less 1,000 calories. And I think Dr. Kevin Hall put it best.
Is there anything intrinsically harmful to eating 800 kilocalories daily forever?
Assuming survival is a long-term benefit, then a diet with substantially more kilocalories a day is beneficial for humans. The diet wizard hasn't cured starvation mode with their strange methods. They've just created the illusion that Bob is eating more. Bob doesn't start his diet journey closely aware of his eating. Maybe it's the shame, maybe it's just how hard it is to diet, but he doesn't really know what he's eating yet. The illusion starts when the wizard blames something else for the problem. Insulin, or a leaky gut, or toxins. They're probably not the problem, and to the extent that there is a kernel of truth there, the wizard actually isn't qualified to diagnose them. But even though it's wrong, it's enough to get past Bob's initial resistance, to get past his shame, and to convince him the problem isn't you, it's them. They don't understand you, you're broken, and I can fix you. Then the wizard multiplies Bob's awareness around his eating in two ways. First, by giving him rules around his eating, which of course now everything he eats he has to bounce against those rules. But more importantly, by giving him permission to eat more. Because any shame that he had that might push some of those little bites out of his mind, I'm trying to eat more. And so he keeps that in his awareness. If there is magic in the wizard's prescription, it's in those restrictions, those rules. Often the reasoning behind them is just silly. It doesn't really matter for our diets if we LARP as cavemen or if we design our diet to fix the insulin HPA axis toxin system. But what it does is it tends to push people towards whole food, grains, vegetables, fruits, lean meats, things that are generally more wholesome for you and lack a lot of that hyper palatable engineered junk food quality that makes overeating easier. These foods are very high in volume and low in calories. They make you feel like you're eating more. So what really happened to Bob? He went from eating 2,600 calories and assuming he was eating 1,200 calories. Now he's eating 2,000 calories and measuring that he's eating 1,900 calories. That 600 calorie difference means that he starts losing weight. Maybe again, maybe for the first time, starts losing about a pound, pound and a half a week-ish. And he's expecting this to feel bad because diets are supposed to feel bad, but oftentimes that initial weight loss, that initial set, actually he feels more peppy, not to mention successful. So this feeling of being broken and now fixed makes sense. So you might agree with all that. The metabolism stuff is nifty, and now we know a little bit more about how the Bobs of the world really work. But you might be thinking to yourself, so what? Who cares if the story is off if Bob finds a diet that works for him? Unfortunately, there's a second half of that story that we rarely hear. If Bob is lucky, he reaches a new normal in his body weight, his eating habits, a normal that he likes. And research shows that he may regain some of that weight, but oftentimes dieters don't regain all of it. So maybe he loses 30 pounds and gets 15 pounds of it back. But in the end, he's still 15 pounds lighter, he's more aware of his food, and he's happier. That's great. Rare, but great. Unfortunately, most Bobs aren't that lucky. For all the reasons we talked about before, after an initial success in weight loss, it slows down and then stalls. Sometimes he can kind of push through it a little bit and it might dip and then stall and then dip and then stall, but eventually the weight loss stops. So what does Bob do now? Starvation mode doesn't explain what's happening to him. That was fixed. Now, most Bobs, their first strategy is just to double down on whatever story the diet guru said to explain starvation mode. So their list of paleo-approved foods might get narrower and narrower and narrower. They start low carb and then go keto and then carnivore, or they start out vegan and then end up whole food, raw, fair trade, organic vegan. And that may work for a while, but white knuckling a diet usually only goes so far. And if it becomes an obsession, if it starts to leak into every choice and every action in their lives, it can cause more stress and more problems than the extra weight did. And that's a best case, because it assumes that this greater commitment even works. Dieting subreddits are littered with the stories of people who committed to the most extreme versions of these diets and either didn't see success or worse, suffered enough side effects that they were forced to stop. So now Bob is back to square one, but worse. Because before he was broken. Now he's broken, a failure, and he can't even admit how much he's struggling because of how much he preached to his friends and family and social media network about this amazing diet. There is a way out for Bob, but it starts by leaving that busted model behind. It wasn't his metabolism, he wasn't broken, he wasn't in starvation mode. He is faced with the challenge of burning more than he takes in. And acknowledging the fact that for a lot of people, that's really hard. To make a lasting change, Bob is probably going to have to change his eating environment and become more aware of what he eats instead of just following made-up rules. He's going to have to eat less, so he needs to find foods that meet his needs and are satisfying enough that he can keep doing it. That may mean that Bob doesn't diet at all, because it's not a high enough priority in his life right now to invite the stress of starving and the possibility of failure. Or it might mean he seeks professional help, a long-term coach who can help with that accountability and the troubleshooting through those issues, or a doctor who can search for confounding issues and maybe prescribe medication. Whatever Bob chooses, he can go into it without shame or a distorted picture of reality and what's got him to where he is today. So if you're like Bob and you're listening to this now, I just want you to know that you are not the problem. It's a complex issue, but if there is one problem, it's the diet wizard who tells you that it's not hard. It doesn't have to be hard. Just follow my one simple trick, my one easy cure, and all of those issues will just go away. They're the problem. If you've tried to lose weight in the past and haven't succeeded, it's not because you're broken. It's because it's a hard thing to do in the food environment that we're in. And to make substantial changes that can improve your health in the long term, takes the right conditions, and may take several attempts, with the support of family, friends, coaches, whatever we can gather to make it work. So whatever you choose to do, I wish you good luck, and thanks for watching.